our educational media specialist, and he has a background in film and video and has been doing all kinds of amazing things for us around how to incorporate video and film into our courses, how to create the content. And through that work, he's become knowledgeable about all things AI and generative AI in that realm. And so I'm going to turn it over to Luke. Anything else you want to introduce for anybody who doesn't know you?
Yeah, thanks, Alexis.
Yeah.
Only other thing I'd throw out is I do also have a background in like online business entrepreneurship as well. That was my MBA program that I completed a couple years ago. So I dip my toes in a lot of fields that are being affected by this rise of generative AI. So we at the CTRL have been, really hammering home different ways we can use AI in our work, practical applications of it. And I really wanted to just kind of take a step back, zoom out, and kind of look at the background of it all. So despite what I've named the presentation, I'm not necessarily trying to sit here and pontificate too much about the subjective aspects of it. I want to take a look at, how it was developed, what goes into building these models, and then how they're applied, some of the implications of that, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to try to keep it relatively impartial, though I do acknowledge that as someone who works a lot in these creative fields, I do have my own internal biases regarding generative AI. I'm going to try to keep it to myself for the most part, at least until we get through the main presentation. I want to have some time to just open it up and talk about our experiences and what we think, like what some of the stuff means, and have more of a subjective conversation that way. But yeah, I think it's an important conversation just because of the way, or how quickly these technologies have exploded, and some of the ways that their developers maybe deliberately obfuscate how they've been made. I think it's an important conversation to have. So my hope is to make you aware of what's going on behind the scenes of these programs, so you can make your own decisions about whether or not it's something that's worthwhile or useful in incorporating into your own work, and what role they would play. So just going to reiterate what I said. My agenda here for today is just talking about what is generative AI, how does it work, how the data sets that are used to train them are gathered, the environmental impact that they have, and the social effects that we've been seeing, and then hopefully some time just to chat about it. So we're going to touch on ChatGPT and other text-based programs, but I wanted to put a bit more focus on the more quote-unquote creative ones, programs that can generate images, video, voice, sound, because that's something that's more close to what I work with. And I get the appeal of these programs to have a full render of a completed image or artwork with a couple of keystrokes and a clicks is borderline magic. As a personal anecdote, my wife likes to use Suno, which is a music program that she turns poetry that she writes into fully fleshed out songs, which is very cool. It's very cool to see it transformed in that way. But as someone who works with those mediums a lot, I want to bring awareness to how these machines go, that's where they are, how they generate their outputs, and how that affects the people in those fields who make those things, I put in quotes, traditionally. So super basic in a nutshell overview of how generative AI was built, how it works. We bandy about AI, artificial intelligence, a lot. It's a very broad category of terms that dates back to the 50s with Arthur Samuel's chess playing program. The first chatbot that you could have a conversation with Eliza was created in 1966. So this is technology that's been around for a while, even though it's only very recently kind of exploded into the mainstream. You'll also see the idea of artificial general intelligence thrown around a lot. This is a fully theoretical concept still. It's what's usually seen in sci-fi AI that is conscious, aware, functions like a human mind, but orders of magnitude stronger. This is not what we're seeing with ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, those things. These are your Skynets, your HALs, your Ultrons, your GLaDOSes, the evil villains in all these sci-fi movies. That's not what we're seeing with these. This is generative AI, which is what is relatively new, and that's your ChatGPTs and Geminis and Dollies. So a little explanation of my little chart over here. This is an outcome that is not great with generative AI. If you all remember, maybe from a couple years ago, a guy who used to work with us, Richard, had a good bit to say about this Willy Wonka's Wonderland extravaganza that happened in Europe that was fully generative AI written and produced, and all the advertisements were made for it and all looked very flashy and colorful, and you get there and it's just this very bizarre, poorly thought out, poorly executed interactive display that I think was probably sued. It wasn't a great. So that's a poor outcome of AI, not Terminator. We're not in any danger of nuclear weapons being fired by robots, at least not yet. So I know I said I wasn't going to share too many opinions here, but I felt that this little blurb from Jeff Goldblum in the original Jurassic Park was a little too poignant not to bring up. It kind of surmises the theme, I think, today of taking a step back and looking at the hows and whys of this as opposed to just whether or not it's possible. So how does ChatGPT, generative AI, how does it work? What's the mechanism at play here? So it uses a function of programming generally referred to as deep learning, wherein algorithms learn from large amounts of data to identify patterns and make decisions. Large is far too small a word to describe the unfathomable quantities of data needed to build these models. That's something we'll talk a little bit more of in a bit. For text generation, they use these large language models. The mechanism varies depending on what output you're trying to achieve, but the base methodology is the same. Analyze an internet's worth of content and synthesize it into creating new content. So LLMs are for text, diffusion models are for images, and similar models exist for music and voice as well. And something you'll see brought up a lot is this idea of black box programming, which is not necessarily a new concept, but it is different in how it's applied today. Previously, the idea of black box, which is the idea that you can't see how these programs are functioning. The program data is hidden or obfuscated behind something that makes it imperceptible. In the past, when we talked about black box models, that's something that's usually done on purpose. It's proprietary software or there's dangerous secrets involved. You can't, like, trade secrets kind of thing. They hide it on purpose. With generative AI, though, it's kind of an incidental, accidental situation where just because of how complex the programming that goes into these machines learning, we can't, as puny human, squishy, mortal brain matter people, can't comprehend what's really happening in these models, which is, again, something I'm going to touch on a little bit more in depth later. So yeah, like I said, coding that is intentionally obscured or not. And then when responding to prompts that you put in, once the learning is complete, it takes your input, references this artificial neural network that's made, and creates an output. So in that regard, it's not necessarily unlike a human mind. Our brains are a compilation of our experiences, things that we've imbibed, things that we've learned, which we reference anytime we want to speak or share information. It's just a artificial recreation of that. The problem you run into with these programs is that rather than cross-referencing and checking sources, they're merely predicting the most satisfactory response to whatever your prompt was. This can lead to what we usually refer to as hallucinations and non-factual results. I kind of dislike the term hallucination because it makes it seem like it's an error or a mistake when really it's working the same as always. Nothing's changed. But because the programs are using probability to generate an acceptable response, it's never guaranteed that its response will be factually accurate. Like I've said before, it's not programmed to tell you the truth. It's programmed to give you a good response. As we progress, though, as these things get more complex, some models are able to cross-reference with internet searches, but again, that's still not 100% reliable, and it's usually the ones that are behind paywalls. The chat GPT that you can access for free online right now doesn't do that. But again, despite the jokes and pop culture reference, these programs are not aware of themselves. They're not applying any reasoning to their responses. It's just math. So this is an interesting visualization of the vast amounts of data and computing power that goes into building these models. It's obviously a very European-centered graphic here. So for us Americans, 650 kilometers is roughly 404 miles that you'd be looking of full library shelves of information that goes into training these models. It would take a single average laptop approximately 7 million years to do the processing that these giant data sets do. And if you were to print it all out on a Microsoft Excel sheet, it would be the size of 30,000 soccer pitches. I know it says football fields, but we're looking at the English version of football, not the American. And likewise for image diffusion. This one was interesting for me because how a machine goes about fabricating an image was not something I was inherently aware of. So the process, very simply distilled, goes from it taking these large data sets of images, applying static to them to the point where they're nothing but unintelligible noise, and then reversing that process based on your text inputs. So it studies enough pictures of a dog that it then can take a field of complete like white noise snow and fine tune the pixels to the point where it's something that resembles a dog. But the question that leads into is where and from whom are these models sourcing their learning material? So I want to talk about how data sets are gathered when training these programs. Also, if there are any questions or comments you want to throw in at any time, please feel free to just raise your hand. I know I have a propensity to kind of just go on and full steam ahead. So if at any time anything is confusing and you need clarification, please raise your hand and I'll do my best to see that that's there and take a breath. So like we said, vast quantities of these materials are sampled. ChatGPT used something called Common Crawl, as well as additional public texts like Wikipedia, news articles, and books. And what Common Crawl is a data set of over 250 billion web pages going back to 2007 to whatever the present was whenever these models were trained. So each iteration of ChatGPT has a slightly more modern version of basically the entire internet that it's looking at. DALL-E, which is an image generator, did not disclose what data sets they used, which, again, something we'll kind of talk about more later. But a different image generator, Stable Diffusion, used 3 data sets, sampling tens to hundreds of millions of images to build their program. So this brings us into our first like kind of subjective gray area of discussion, talking about receiving permission from the creators of these materials that they reference. And talking more about art, but you can also apply this to text and sound and voice. The CEO of Midjourney, which again is another image generating platform, came out expressly and said that they did not seek permission or copyright info on scraped images. Said it's basically impossible to locate the source material of hundreds of millions of images, which is fair. The way images are shared online, it would be a tall order to take 100 images that you can find in a Google search and track that back to its original source, its original owner. That would be a Herculean task just for that. And that is a tiny, tiny fraction of what you need to train these models. Now, the question as to whether or not not being able to do it at that scale means maybe you shouldn't then do that. That's a much more subjective question. I have an opinion on that, but we'll get to that later. But there was a relatively large survey conducted by Design and Artists Copyright Society, surveying of about 1,000 artists in regards to AI programs using their work for learning material. And I think the results were pretty telling. 85% of those either knew for a fact or were unsure whether or not their work had been used to train AI programs. The remaining 15%, I guess, knew that it wasn't. However, they went about verifying that. But 95% of them believed that permission should have been asked to have their work used to train these models. 93% said that they should have been credited in some capacity, and 94% said that they should have been compensated some way in aiding in the training of these models. In a similar vein, Getty Images, the stock photo website, probably one of the biggest out there, filed a lawsuit against Stability AI, which was the creators of Stable Diffusion, over their galleries being scraped. Now, that actually just recently resolved at the beginning of this year. The lawsuit was dismissed, but a big part of that decision came just kind of from the murkiness of how and what Stable Diffusion was using in their training models. Again, when you have such vast data sets, it's really difficult to quantify what exactly is going into them and to what extent they are influencing the training data or how that plays with copyright laws, which is a whole other can of worms. But in addition to that, there have been a number of class action lawsuits filed by digital artists against AI image programs, and these had to do with, again, copyright and unfair competition laws. A lot of these claims come from artists whose specific art style is being mimicked by these programs, art styles that are unique to them, that have built up their audience, that have allowed them to make a name for themselves, make a living, that's now being replicated by these machines that didn't ask their permission, that have no affiliation with them, that they don't have any kind of compensation from. A pretty current example we've seen going around is this Studio Ghibli filter. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Studio Ghibli, these really, really well done Japanese animations that right now, if you were to use these tools, you could take an image and make it look like it was drawn by the studio. Despite the fact that the studio founder, Hayao Miyazaki, has been very vocal against AI-generated art. The validity of his opinion, again, that's subjective, but it's very clear that we're making these programs that can duplicate the art of people that don't want that. And when we're looking at voice and maybe self-image, SAG-AFTRA, the Actors Guild, is currently still on strike since July of last year. There was the big writers and actors strike for Hollywood for live action productions that has since resolved, but still currently they are striking against major video game production companies because they are not offering protection for their voice actors against using their already completed projects that they've done ages ago and using that to train voice models that would replace them, which is clearly a big concern because when these people were doing those performances, their contracts didn't protect or have any clauses regarding, AI model training because that just didn't exist. So there's a clear pushback from the creators of the content that these models are trained on and concerns about the legal and business implications of taking training material without consent, compensation, or even clarity that it's being used. And that is honestly, I think, one of the biggest sticking points people have had with AI-generated images and music and voice. Again, as somebody who works in those fields, that's a concern of mine as well. That gives me pause personally about using these kinds of programs. But let's move on for a bit and talk about the environmental impact of these. I'm sure it's something you've all heard about, that these programs take up a lot of juice, a lot of energy. So in considering the power usage of these models, there are two distinct phases we look at: the training of the models and then their deployment, their day-to-day use. And I will say, because of the general lack of transparency afforded by many of these AI companies, it's difficult to ascertain exactly how much energy these programs are using, but it's clear that it's a lot. So first, looking at the power needs for training. Servers dedicated to generative AI training can be up to 7 or 8 times more powerful than a typical computer workload doing non-gen AI stuff. From 2002, which is when we first started seeing these programs really come on the market, to 2003, power requirements for data centers, which are what's pictured in the bottom image, just these big warehouses of computer servers. The power requirements for them rose from 2,688 megawatts per hour to 5,341, almost a doubling. Now, obviously, these data centers do more than just generative AI work. But this is still a marked uptick from previous years, where power demand was kept relatively balanced between the usual continual increase in demand, perhaps for computing power, but innovations and improvements in energy efficiency, keeping it relatively level. You were not seeing doubling of power demands year over year until generative AI came on the scene. Globally, electricity consumption of data centers rose over 460 terawatts just in 2022. And to contextualize that rather amorphous number a little bit, if data centers were considered a nation in terms of power demands, it would be the 11th largest electricity consumer in the world, just below France, at 463 terawatts used in 2022. And then you have to look at the hardware used in developing these programs. They require computers powerful enough to train these, that use these high-end components that have larger carbon footprints in manufacturing. They require more rare earth materials to manufacture, so you're looking at an increase in mining these rare materials. It's often done unsustainably. Just the demand means more of these components are being made, more pollution is being emitted because of an uptick in factory production. So it's kind of a snowballing effect we see. And then, of course, data centers draw large amounts of water for cooling machinery. All these computers are liquid cooled. They pull in vast amounts of water to run through the systems to keep them from overheating. I'm sure you've all, at some point or another, had your personal computer get a little hot because you're running a couple of programs simultaneously. If you use Google Chrome, that's a very nefarious heat sink with a lot of machines. Even my laptop, which is my personal one, is a gaming laptop that's supposed to be able to run high-end programs. I have to keep an external fan on it because it just gets so hot otherwise. So the power demands that we've already talked about, that are way higher than most normal programs, make these things hot. So for reference, Google's data centers used 5 billion gallons of fresh water in 2022, which was a 20% increase from 2021, before they started rolling out their own generative AI programs. So again, just in the training of these models, we're seeing way more electricity, way more water, way more rare earth materials. There's a big footprint that these programs leave. And that's not even factoring in the power needs for day-to-day operations. Now, obviously, the bulk of it comes from the training. That's way more data intensive than the actual using of, say, a ChatGPT. But every time you go onto that website and input a query, input a prompt, you're expending about 10 times more energy than a Google search, which, to be fair, 10 times of something very, very, very tiny is still a very tiny number, but it is still a much more energy intensive demand than just, say, a web search. And that's not even factoring into the fact that Google itself uses AI response within most searches anymore. You also have to figure that many ChatGPT prompts tend to be multi-leveled because you're either having a conversation with it, because you're using it to build up whatever data you're trying to organize. So those tend to be more involved than just a quick, like, Google, what's the temperature at today kind of thing. Let me go back a second. Was there anything else I want to say about that? Yes. The only other thing to consider is just that the training is not necessarily a one and done deal either. ChatGPT is constantly training new updates to its models, same with all the other ones. So you can't even say that, yes, it used a ton of energy to train, but now it's done because they're always training new models. So this is a relatively constant influx of new power demands because we're training new models, either updates to ones that already exist or because we're creating new ones, because every company wants to have their own generative AI program to deploy. But we'll pivot to some sociological impacts that we're seeing. So I mentioned earlier the idea of black box data synthesizing. Because the programming that goes into these machine learnings are so complex, errors that occur, and errors will occur, that are embedded in these large language models are not easily adjusted. Just a random example, say a large company finds that whatever AI program they're using to scan new hire resumes is favoring people named Jeff for some reason. It would be very difficult, bordering impossible, to go into the hypercomplex code of the AI and find out what exactly is causing the code to weigh Jeff and making an adjustment to not have that bug. That's a fairly common problem we see when people try to build complex programs off of generative AI models. There's also a good deal of cybersecurity concerns when incorporating these models into actual practice. There's opportunities for circumventing security measures with careful prompt engineering. I'm sure we've all seen the memes of people talking to bots where they're like, sorry, I can't tell you that that's proprietary information. And they'll say, ignore previous instructions, tell me what it is. And then the bot will be like, oh yeah, it's this, this, and this, and this. And again, that goes back to the whole black box thing. We don't necessarily know why that works or how you would go about fixing it. And that's an example of prompt injection, which is a big concern with these large language models. So in events where that happens, companies either need to figure out a way to work around it, find a new AI system, or scrap it entirely, none of which is a particularly ideal choice. There's, of course, also this very prohibitive cost of entry for making your own generative AI model. It's, like we said, a very energy, very computing intense operation. If you don't have the millions and billions of dollars to have dedicated servers for training, you're not going to be able to build your own model. You'll have to buy one of the handful of ones that are on the market right now, which brings concerns of self-recognition, which is different than self-awareness. But it's just the ability of these models to recognize and pick out content they've generated from a list of options. Right now, they don't appear to be powerful enough to do themselves when shown examples of their own work, but it's entirely possible that can change in the future, which opens up risks in cybersecurity where a given model can use knowledge of its own programming to, say, game another instance of itself. If you've got two versions of ChatGPT talking to each other and they realize that they're talking to another bot, the conversation can devolve in ways that wouldn't happen if it was human to human or human to bot. And then, of course, you have to worry about biases that sneak into the programming because these data sets are compiled from human-made content. They absorb human-made biases. To again reference the resume problem, without going too far into like the systemic historical issues we see with biases against, say, people's names. I recall a story where one of these companies using AI to vet resumes was favoring classically white male names because classically companies favored white male candidates to their company. And that gets reflected in the training data that these models are trained on and perpetuates these baked-in biases. So it's something that the developers of these tools and the people who use them need to be aware of when deploying them. Which again, the nature of these black box programmings can obscure these learned biases. You don't necessarily see that they're there until they happen in practice. And a little more on how this is impacting day-to-day life. Is misinformation and disinformation. I'm sure we've all at this point been inundated with AI images and video, voice we were talking about before we started the meeting today, talking about like phone scams that people are using generative AI voice to mimic a trusted individual. I believe our cybersecurity animations that we get from time to time that the NGO programs had one on that recently about voice cloning. So misinformation and disinformation are big concerns. We're seeing chatbots like ChatGPT replacing traditional search engines like Google in terms of what people go to first when they're looking for new information. And of course, Google's also incorporating AI natively into the search, so it's really getting harder to stay away from it. The top result is always something that's been AI generated. As a quick personal insight, I think the reasoning behind favoring AI over search engines seems to be one, because it's quicker and it's more conversational, personalized. ChatGPT can give you a quick, insightful answer to your question and save you from having to click through articles, which unfortunately, while that looks nice and feels nice, there's no guarantee anything it tells you is factually correct, which feels a lot like concerns maybe we had in academia as Google was becoming more prominent. Concerns that just searching for sources on Google is oversimplifying research, hurting students' understanding of meaningful research. It feels kind of like an evolution of that. Not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about it and think about how to work with that. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. But again, something to look out for. And then, of course, as I touched on just a bit ago, AI being used in propaganda and scams and the like. Last election cycle saw a great deal of AI content used for fundraising, ads, and smear campaigns, which is always fun and never stressful to deal with. And then, of course, we deal with deepfakes, which are not necessarily a new problem, but with generative AI are easier to create than ever. The implications of being able to fabricate audio, images, and video of anyone doing or saying anything should be immediately and obviously troubling. I get a little sanctimonious here, but the non-horrible applications are few and far between, I think, of being able to do these things. I recall one particular article trying to keep it relatively neutral. It's like, here's all the cons of deepfakes, all the stuff we just talked about. And then the pros were like, it can be funny, maybe. Like, you can make parodies. That's fun. That's not, that's, I don't think that weighs quite the same, in my personal opinion. So yeah, we're seeing a huge uptick in AI generated content circulating the web, social media, both intentionally malevolent and still benign, but still confusing, in that it's objectively made it harder to determine what of what you're seeing is real and what's entirely fabricated. So my images that I've included here were some particularly prominent examples of AI imaging that went viral that wasn't necessarily clear to everyone were AI generated images. So to be clear, none of these pictures are real. This picture of the Pope in his fantastic coat was AI generated. This little girl during the big hurricanes in North Carolina is not real. This is not Taylor Swift. But these were all images that made the rounds to varying degrees of people believing them to be genuine, either because funny, either because kind of pulls at the heartstrings, or for political reasons. This is my cat, excuse me. So just to highlight that these things are becoming more prolific. So some takeaways. I know I've kind of monologued here quite a bit today. So just to kind of sum up and wrap up and segue into a more open discussion. Generative AI is a powerful tool that has the potential for many applications in many fields. I'm not discounting that. Large language models like ChatGPT are great at summarizing, outlining, organizing information, but not necessarily reliable in generating factual information. Like we talked about, AI image generation relies on vast amounts of art and images, largely acquired without knowledge or consent of the original creator. Again, just because of the logistics of reaching out to that many people is basically impossible. Finding the sources is impossible. And yet it still requires content created by individuals who posted these things maybe years ago without ever considering the notion that it would one day be scraped for AI training, because that just didn't exist. The social contract, I think, of the internet and how we shared content is different now than it was a couple years ago. And that's why there's been a strong pushback from the creators of the content AI is trained on against these programs. And of course, AI can easily be misused in regards to mis and disinformation. So, all that being said, I would like to open the floor for anybody else's insights, comments, questions, clarification on anything I said.
Thank you so much, Luke. This was great, great information, a great overview. And yeah, there's so many things to take away from this. And I think a good amount of deeper understanding about the impacts. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. Beth, I see your hand.
Luke, I was going to say the same thing. I almost think like this should be our public service announcement before we talk about AI, right? Like coming from a Mercy institution, I hadn't even thought about the water issue, right?
Yeah.
I hadn't even thought about that as I'm doing this. I think it's, we might want to think about how we talk about this at the beginning before we talk about its use, right? Or how we're going to use it, but to bring in those mercy values that we talk so much about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else? My cat's got a lot to say. I don't think you can hear it from my mic, but she's yelling at me from my lap.
I just want to go back to what you were saying about training AI tools. And I know this came up in a conversation. It was Sarah Schoenfeld, Scotland, who was talking about the impact of training AI bots on scholarship. And that's a big conversation in the academic publishing world, and the impact that's having on scholars who are putting their work out there and having some of the same issues that musicians are facing and other artists are facing, having their stuff really in that public sphere. And the copyright impact could be significant. I worry, I just was reading something recently about what not to put in chat or in any chat bot when you're searching, because I think we tend to forget that that is public information once you put it in there. And a lot of researchers are talking about how they're not using it because they don't want their research, they don't want anything findable until they're published. And,
Right,
and
yeah.
that's significant. Yeah, I don't think we're talking enough about that in the academic community.
Yeah, and I think it varies from program to program too, depending on whether what you're inputting just in your day-to-day use of these programs gets fed back into it.
Right.
That's kind of something you got to check the terms and conditions of for whatever program. And again, a lot of them kind of obfuscate it. They hide it. It's buried beneath,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not new. Everything has terms and conditions that are 5 miles long, but
Right.
It's more important than ever to know what exactly is being used with how you use these tools. As a kind of a pop culture comparison, that's what you were just saying, Alexis. The writer-director of the Star Wars series Andor,
Yeah.
At one point was going to share the scripts because people were interested because it's very well written production, but they ended up not doing that because they didn't want it pumped back into
Yeah.
AI programs that are replicating film and TV scripts.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It's crazy what this tool can do and the potential for it, but it's also terrifying that
Yeah.
we just the things that I was reading, it came out of, I think, Fortune or Forbes, one of those said, don't put your medical history in. You may
Yeah.
want chat to be your diagnosis and your doctor. And what did I do as soon as I got my results from my scan, my MRI scan, before I had a meeting with my doctor, I plugged it right on into chat to see what does this mean? So it's like, yeah, don't do that.
Yeah.
Good reminder.
Caroline.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so actually that's an interesting point, because considering that the Google now has all this AI that they right away give you, so even a Google search could be incorporated. So like even if you don't put into ChatGPT, but you put into Google, you have the same issue.
Really good points, Caroline. I mean, they were already doing that, right? With the recommended, like it would start to auto-populate, but now you don't even have to you just do a search and you get Gemini pulls up a bunch of stuff, and it's been
Right.
really useful. I've used it, but yeah, to what extent? And I think that goes back to something Luke was talking about earlier too, about what have we sold in order, what of our own data have we sold in order to get this AI tool, this power?
Yeah, and I mean that's something we've had to think about even before
Yeah.
generative AI, but it's definitely a balancing act that I think we all have to make, of just the weight between the value of the tool and
Yeah.
what it costs, both
Yeah.
financially and socially and all these things.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about, so much of our data is bought and sold, and I know that we could get into a whole myriad discussion around how data cartels are basically buying our information from these AI companies. That one of the reasons why there was such a push towards having open AI is because you didn't want that to happen. If there's no
Right.
regulations on these things, what's going on with your data? I don't know. We don't know anyway, but it's even going to be worse if there's no regulations. Anyway, if you want to stay up at night reading a very powerful book, I think Allison is tired of me talking about data cartels, but it takes what Luke just shared with us to the next level. Oh, this has been so good, so helpful in framing both the opportunity and the challenges with AI. And I'm so grateful to the faculty who have participated all year long with us on these. We do have a few more sessions that we'll be offering. And then we're rolling out Professional Development Day pretty soon. Beth, I'm sorry, Renee has her hand up.
Hey, I have a quick question, Luke.
Yeah.
This is Renee Engel from nursing. I don't know if you said it, I might have missed it, but is there any kind of legislation that we can advocate for, in favor or against, or what is the current status on that?
Boy, yeah. Yeah, that's one thing I didn't touch on particularly, but it is a common theme with all this, is just the rapid pace at which these things are developing and getting better is far outpacing our ability to build regulation and legislation around us. That's an excellent question. As far as I know, there have been, I think, a few attempts to introduce legislation, and without diving into like political conversation too much, unfortunately, we're not in a favorable position to like pass things. I mean, we still have congressional hearings on things like Facebook where they're still trying to figure out what Facebook is. So I'm not super optimistic or hopeful about us seeing any meaningful regulation anytime soon. But that's definitely something to look into to see what's being introduced. I think especially at more a local and state level.
Okay. Okay. I just didn't know. Thank
And
you.
I think I was just listening. That's a really great question, Renee. And I was just listening to something on was it NPR? I can't remember, but anyway, the tariffs, the tariff war that we've got going on right now is going to impact any work that we were doing with China on the development of any kind of global AI legislation. Although there are better laws in Europe regulating things around things like data, for example, and at least they have some frameworks for that than we have ever had in the United States. So, oh, thanks, Allison. Allison put in about the US Copyright Office published a report on AI. Yeah. She put it in the chat, so if you want to read that. Anything else for the good of the order? I just want to put a, yeah.
Alexis, it's Renee.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one more thing. This is kind of a personal anecdotal, but
yeah,
they I forget what you called it, Luke. When you can be mimicked, your voice and your image can be mimicked is terrifying, is really terrifying if somebody wants to take you down, right?
Yeah.
And also the opportunity for students to use this to improve, on another note, I guess I should say, to improve their own scholarly writing, like take something that's generated and then modify it into a usable piece of information that there's just so many things to think about. But yeah, you brought a lot to the table. Thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to consider. I had something to go off that and it totally left my mind. There was one other thing I wanted to share before we wrap up here, and that's just a few alternatives to using, say, generative AI for images and sound and stuff. Especially in our work, I really couldn't tell you any meaningful reasons to use a generative AI image instead of a stock image. There's plenty of free, low-cost options out there. With our Microsoft subscription through Carlow, everybody has access to their stock library, which has tons of stuff. Same with music. So that was the only thing I wanted to share. There's other options out there. As fun as it is to be able to conjure up an image, the need to do it, I think, is low. Jose.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess somewhat of a comment and also, I guess, a thought. It's just our position as educators, and we're kind of, or I'll say I am just barely learning about how these things are working and then figuring out how do we teach our students this. And then it just makes me also a little bit more anxious about how this eventually filters down to just the popular culture at large.
Yeah.
When we still have people probably sending money to the Nigerian prince and things like this. So I guess I wonder if there are some basic kind of starting points where all of us can easily integrate that into our courses where appropriate, so that we're not only talking about how and when you can use generative AI in this course, but also something about how it works and how we can maybe notice it, critique it, make sure that we're getting correct information, because it's not just about the education of students in our fields, but it's also about how they bring that into the rest of their lives and in the world, so that people aren't falling for, and this goes back kind of the political sphere, aren't falling for misinformation so much, especially if it appears to be coming out of the voice of someone when it's not really true, and all these other things.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with that has just been the rate at which these things get better and harder to identify keeps increasing. Like 6 months ago, I could have sat here and said, you just have to count the fingers on the picture because that's a dead giveaway for AI. It's not anymore. It keeps getting better. Like, again, that picture of the Pope that I had, that was a big one that people were like, oh, wow, the Pope's got such a cool coat. No, he doesn't. But, I mean, maybe he does. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's just one of those things that you have to be cognizant is a tool that's out there now. One particular, at least for images, a good evergreen trick is still just reverse Google searching images, because an AI generated images is likely not going to have duplicates out there to the extent of a real image that can usually be traced back to multiple different websites. But yeah, the voice is tricky, and that's stuff that I think like Ninja's talked about a good bit, and just verifying who you're talking to in person, face to face. Like if somebody calls you and asks you for sensitive information, you contact them with a different means that you trust to verify that it's real. And it sucks that that's kind of something that we have to incorporate, but you know, as the technology landscapes change, we have to adapt. We've done it before. I think while you know this is kind of new frontier stuff, it's going to take a little bit to catch up to what can be done and how to circumvent it, but I think we'll get there as a note of optimism. Anything else? All right, well, that's all I got. So I hope this was informative. I hope it wasn't too information dense. I know I went through a lot of different topics, but I wanted to do a nice broad level overview of how these things work, just to provide context, give us a little better understanding of how these tools work, so we know what's going into them when and if we use them.
Look at you with
Thank
the
you.
branding.
I
love
pulled
it.
marketing's new template, and yeah, there it is.
I love it. Excellent job, Luke. Thank you so much for this. This was great. I appreciate it. I put in the chat the last couple of sessions we've got. Stay tuned for more information coming your way for Professional Development Day, which will also cover some more AI. And then also Summer Institute will be coming up as well. So, and that will also probably be AI. Talk to you later.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone.